Beverly Heritage Center in West Virginia. He will be giving today's lecture, More Than Friends, the Queer Chesapeake in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries.
Thank you all so much for being here. It's great to see so many faces, and in particular, so many new faces here. Let me see. Is that good?
Okay, yeah.
Perfect. So this lecture is essentially it's a stationary walking tour. A few years back, two of my closest friends got married, and we all had a joint bachelor party together where we did a haunted pub crawl of Annapolis, and we just had a great time, and our tour guide was fantastic, and I was waiting for my dad to pick me up after we had gone on the tour, and one of the three of us suggested the question, it would be really great if there was something like this for, gay history in Annapolis. And then we all sort of thought about that, and we were kind of wondering, why isn't there something like this? So initially, the talk that I'm about to give today is it's a more focused version of a walking tour that I had done of the city of Annapolis, focusing on 3 centuries of LGBTQ history. In last June, this was something that we gave in cooperation with Annapolis Pride as a fundraiser for the first inaugural Annapolis Pride as well. You can see here this is a walking tour. We started off at Goth's Court, visited Church Circle, State Circle, went down to the city docks, and then we ended up by Hammond Forward House because I'm familiar with it. One of the things that I have found both really interesting and really frustrating is just the nature of trying to research this. Talking about LGBTQ history is essentially a very personal account of someone's life. It's someone's private life. Usually, this is not the sort of thing that there's much in the way of public records about. Most of the cases that we'll be talking today that do focus on the public records focus on it essentially in a moment of crisis. This is a case where things go very, very wrong, which is how this information gets to be exposed to the public in the first place. Related to that also is the issue of terminology. Claire Lyons from the University of Maryland talks about the fact that if you're trying to go through 18th century newspapers and looking for queer history, essentially one of the things that you'll find is that someone will be accused of something like indecency or maybe public exposure, but if it's two people involved and they're two people of the same gender, reading between the lines, you can deduce that there was probably some same-sex activity involved. Interestingly enough, a former staff member at London Town by the name of Kyle Dalton published a web article about Sodomy in the British Navy, focusing on the 18th century, and one of the observations that he makes is the fact that it's clear that there are cases of this happening, but oftentimes what ends up happening is that even when people know that, let's say that there was an activity going on between two men, usually they aren't punished for the offense of sodomy. At that point in the British Navy, sodomy was an offense punishable by death. And although it does happen where people are essentially caught in the act and they are killed for it, what happens more often is that it tends to be that there's a much lighter sentence, like the aforementioned indecency or a public exposure, something that in the 18th century would have required punishment by imprisonment, but not by death. The other issue which the current slide refers to is the problem of the romantic friendship. Now, I notes are all out of order. In the 18th and 19th centuries in particular, you were much more likely to have close associations with people who looked like you and who had similar backgrounds to you. So the idea, you know, in the industrial age, and particularly during both world wars, one of the things that's such a big turnover and a real big moment of crisis is the fact that all of a sudden, you know, you're in the same trenches with a duke and a factory worker can be associating with each other in very intimate terms, you know, sharing the same spaces where you eat and where you sleep. In the 18th and 19th century, though, there's much more of a, you're much more likely to be closely associated with people of your own social class and also of your gender. A good example of this is actually Eleanor Roosevelt. A couple of my colleagues work up at Arthurdale in northern West Virginia, which was essentially Eleanor Roosevelt's New Deal village. And this is one of the questions that they were asking me about, like, how do we talk about the fact that Eleanor Roosevelt might have been bisexual? And for me, this is an incredibly difficult topic to talk about because Eleanor Roosevelt was extremely good friends with a woman who worked for the AP Press who was out as a lesbian even back in the 1930s. And in the letters that Eleanor Roosevelt writes to the woman by the name of her name evades me. I want to say Lorena Hickok, but I think I may be confusing her with someone else. In any case, this is an issue where Mrs. Roosevelt's letter to this woman are very affectionate, and they talk about sort of a close physical intimacy between them. That, however, is not a smoking gun for saying that there was anything more than a strong friendship between the two women. There's no real reference to any overt sexual activity that happens between these two women. So it's a extremely gray area, and my advice for my colleagues at Arthurdale was to talk about the reporter for the AP Press, because we know that she visited that site, and I think that her story is just as interesting to tell as Mrs. Roosevelt's. In the 18th and 19th century, particularly, there are several instances about women living together. The term Boston marriages refers to unmarried women who are living together. And if anyone has had the chance to read Charity and Sylvia by Rachel Hope Cleaves, that's about two women in Vermont in the first 4 decades of the 1800s who lived together. And it's essentially an open secret in their little village that Miss Charity and Miss Sylvia are intimate. They share a bed. I believe Charity gives Sylvia a ring to wear on her finger, which is understood to be a wedding ring. But in that case, the author of that book makes it very. It's such a good book. Just read it. One of the things that she does is she's very clear about establishing that this was a romantic relationship, it was a sexual relationship, and all of these things that Charity and Sylvia do together are indicative of a married couple. So there's a bunch of other preambles that I could give about the background of researching queer history. The difficulty with terminology, the difficulty of, how do you refer to, the question of labeling is always a problem, and it's one of those things where I'm not going to try and label anyone here, because putting modern labels on historic people is, by its very definition, a problem. the term homosexual wasn't used, for instance, until 1869, and it was used first in a German pamphlet about sexuality. And transgender, I believe, is a term that wasn't used until 1965. So in the grand scheme of things, we're talking about very recent terminology. But, and then, actually, I forgot to include this in my notes. Related to this, I actually wanted to bring you on an example from West Virginia. So I work in a very, very small town right in the middle of the state, and one of the projects I'm currently involved in there involves Civil War era graffiti. Beverly was essentially the site of some of the earliest engagements on land of the Civil War, way before Manassas, and there's a piece of graffiti in one of the buildings. I have not yet gotten permission for a photograph. The owners are a bit, well, yes, but essentially I've seen the piece of graffiti, and there are two names written, so-and-so and so-and-so, and then beneath it is the phrase, our own wife. So,
what does that mean?
Well,
Please.
I'm not entirely sure, because the reason why I'm bringing this up to begin with is the fact that of the two names in question, one is undoubtedly it's a man with a very unique name who, as far as I can tell, originally he came from Australia. He moves to Weston, West Virginia. He enlists in the Confederacy, and then he moves to Baltimore and becomes a lawyer and marries a French woman. The other name, there are a few possibilities. There's another person in the same command who has the same last name, so it could be a female relative of that person. There's also a person who has the exact same name, who was living in Beverly in the 1860 census, and who was a male person. He's an artist, essentially living with a bunch of spinster ladies and a bunch of older men. So, interpreting this phrase, our own wife, if it is in fact the two men in question, if it is not, the one man and a female relative, if it is referring to the two men, this could be graffiti from one of the men, basically talking about a romantic relationship of some kind between the two. It could also be someone else mocking a close friendship between the two, basically sort of saying like, oh, what a bunch of pansies. It's a very, very curious phrase. I have not found its parallel, and the second name, the artist from Beverly, is someone who is really just a blip on the radar. They only appear that once in the 1860 census. So this is something that could for me, I want it to be a same-sex relationship. I want it to be a very happy one too, but we have to keep in mind when we have evidence like this, there are a variety of possibilities to work with, and that's essentially the most important thing to keep in mind when doing this research. Getting to the heart of the matter, and sort of the walking tour portion of this lecture, usually I talk about this story at City Dock. This is a story that shocked the English-speaking world in the 18th century, and it starts in England. In 1746, there was a quack doctor who presented in public as a person by the name of Charles Hamilton, who married a woman named Mary Price. 2 months after their marriage, Mary Price discovered that Charles Hamilton was in fact a woman named Mary Hamilton. 2 months, my thoughts exactly. Mary Price reported the matter, and Charles Mary Hamilton was arrested in Somerset, and the trial quickly became a media circus. One of the local rags, the Newgate Calendar, reported that Charles Mary Hamilton had married up to 14 women and called her, quote, a monopolizer of her own sex. Now, what was interesting about this was that the court had no idea what to charge her with. This was such an unusual circumstance, and eventually the court charged Charles Mary Hamilton with fraud. The verdict of the court was, quote, that he or she prisoner at the bar is an uncommon, notorious cheat, and that we, the court, do sentence her or him, whichever he or she may be, to be imprisoned 6 months, and during that time to be whipped in the towns of Taunton, Glastonbury, Wells, and Shepton Mallet. The case gained such notoriety that Henry Fielding published a mostly fictitious account of the events. And the illustration that you see here comes from an 1813 publication of Henry Fielding's fictitious account. So we start in England, but then we go over to the United States, and Claire Lyons was the one who put me onto this. Several years later, there's another quack doctor, also by the name of Charles Hamilton, who appears on the Eastern Seaboard. As this article from the Pennsylvania Gazette reports, Hamilton had been shipwrecked off the North Carolina coast and had traveled through Virginia and Maryland, basically paying for their journey by conducting their business and treating patients, essentially. In 1752, a letter sent to the newspaper refers to suspicions that Charles Hamilton had been discovered to be a woman in Chester, just outside Philadelphia. Hamilton was arrested and confessed to everything. She is very bold and give no good account of herself. Says she's about 28 years of age, though she seems to be about 40. Now, Hamilton essentially confessed to everything, but again, there was the question of what crime had actually been committed, and after this letter to the Pennsylvania Gazette, there's no other specific reference to this person that can be definitively found. There's another Charles Hamilton who appears in a sort of minor fraud case a few years later, but whether or not it's the same person, it's very difficult to say. Now, what I find interesting, though, is this question of traveling through Virginia and Maryland. If we think about the routes through these two states in the 1750s, it raises the question whether or not Charles Mary Hamilton would have passed through London town on their way up to Pennsylvania. I'd be very interested to talk with the researchers here after the talk about this possibility, but considering how important London town was along these routes, it's very possible that we might have had a visit by Charles Mary back in the day. So moving on to our next 18th century case, again, another person who, in all possibility, passed through London town at several points in their career. This is the case of a German gentleman by the name of Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. Or Steuben. I mean, it's...
Steuben.
I say Steuben, it's the German way.
Steuben is German.
Das ist richtig.
But the other thing is...
Sie haben recht.
The reason why I refer to his name as Steuben is that there's several Steuben counties. There's a Steubenville, I think, in Ohio. In Ferris Bueller's Day Off, I think there's a Steuben Day celebration. And he's an incredibly important figure in the American Revolution. In particular, Steuben's contribution was organizing the army, and what we have here is one of the things that he wrote was a set of regulations for essentially turning this ragtag bunch of American revolutionaries into a full and proper army. And let me see, by Baron de Steuben. But this is the regulations that he wrote, and which were still in use even as late as the War of 1812. Now, Baron von Steuben was originally employed with the Prussian army, and that's where he earned the title of Baron, because he was just good at his job. Originally, Benjamin Franklin had written to him in order to help the fledgling Continental Army, but he turned the offer down initially. Now, that would have been the end of the story until August of 1777, where a letter to the Prince of Hohenzollern Heickingen denounced von Steuben for, quote, having taken familiarities with young boys, which the law forbids and punishes severely, end quote. Nothing was definitively proven at the time, but the letter did circulate, and when that happened, Steuben found it politic to accept Benjamin Franklin's offer in assisting the American troops. The regulations that you see here were published in 1779 after he had, after he had been in the Western Hemisphere for several years. In the United States, Steuben spent most of his time in New York State, but he does have a few very important connections with the state of Maryland. In 1780, he would have passed through Annapolis and probably London town as well, on his way to Mount Vernon to begin taking part in the Southern Campaign in Virginia. At the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, Steuben fought with 2 brigades under his control, and his 2nd brigade was a Maryland regiment led by Brigadier General Mordecai Gist, and it consisted of about 1,000 men. The most important connection that Steuben had with Maryland, though, is that when General Washington resigned from the Army in 1783, he would have been present at the State House. Now, onto the good stuff. Actually, forgive me. This is the Virginia campaign of 1781, showing the movements in Virginia, but getting there, he would have had to, by necessity, have passed through Maryland and probably going along the route of the day. There's the State House. During his time in the United States, Steuben was romantically involved with 3 men, and it seems he was involved sexually with 2. At Valley Forge, Steuben became very close with 2 young officers, many decades his junior, Benjamin Walker, and who we see here on the left, and William North, who we see here on the right. Steuben struggled with English his entire time in the United States, and the letters basically refer to the fact that his favorite word when he was frustrated was to shout over and over again, down, 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 down. So Walker, seeing him struggle with the language, introduced himself to Steuben in French and offered to act as interpreter. And years later, Steuben recalls the moment saying, "If I had seen an angel from heaven, I should not have more rejoiced." He was clearly attracted to both of the younger men, and it's also clear that Walker, so there's General Washington. Walker's right here. Walker and North were also romantically and sexually involved with each other as well. It's clear that William North and Steuben were sexually intimate. It's not clear whether that was the case between Steuben and Walker. I feel like I need to have a chart. Do you have?
This was in Alexander Hamilton, the play they showed this relationship.
Really? I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah.
How explicitly?
In song, in the rap, and also physicality, it was obvious.
I'm glad to see that. The with the letters between Steuben and Walker, it's clear that Steuben was very interested in him. It's not clear whether or not Walker returns his affections, though. Yes.
Sir, is the Steuben the same as Steuben for the student aid rate?
I believe so. Yes.
Yes.
In Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Well, I marched in that as a child.
No kidding.
I performed in it as a gymnast. I am a gymnast. But I ask you this because I was raised in Pedutzi, which is German.
Very interesting.
So I just put this out because thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm. It's a bit of a complicated story between the three gentlemen. But it's clear that Steuben was it was recognized that he was a man who liked men, particularly young officers. That seems to be his taste, and we know that Steuben bought Walker linens, at which point that means underclothing. So a lot of the gifts between the men in question show this, let's say, close relationship between them. That being said, after the war is over, things change a little bit, and the relationship between the three men, they still exchange letters, but since they're not physically near each other, that sort of relationship ends up falling apart. Steuben had been promised a certain amount by the American government for his duties in leading the army, and in the end I can't remember the exact amount, but I think he only received about 1/6 of what he was promised, and he ended up living most of the rest of his life in an isolated farmstead in New York. And a lot of the letters, particularly from North to Steuben, are advising him to spend less. But, the Baron imagined himself to be a European aristocrat living in a court, and so he had problems with his finances because he wanted to live like a baron. Thank you very much. Both North and Walker end up getting married to women, and in Steuben's final years, he has a companion by the name of John Mulligan, who would have lived with him. The Baron adopted Walker and North as his heirs, essentially as his sons, and on his death in 1794, he divided his property between the three men, Walker, North, and Mulligan. In 1817, Benjamin Walker and William North were both widowed, and North wrote to Walker suggesting that the two of them live together as companions. Walker was a little bit more reticent about the offer, and instead he suggested a visit to England. The issue was ultimately rendered moot, though Ben Walker took ill and died suddenly the following year in 1818. But there's a book by William Veneman called Male-Male Intimacy in Early America Beyond Romantic Friendships, which talks about about the relationship between these three men. It's probably where Hamilton got a lot of this information from. And if you're interested in knowing a bit more about them, it's definitely worth looking into. Get ahead of that. So, the next case that I want to talk about is less less related to London town in the Annapolis area, and it's an incident involving the Maryland Court of Appeals. Now, a man by the name of Wilhelms Davies was indicted in Baltimore County in 1810 for assaulting and attempting to commit sodomy on a man named William Carpenter, age 19. The indictment charged that Davies, not having the fear of God before his eyes, how does it say it? Not having the fear of God before his eyes, but being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil on and etc. with force and arms at and etc. in and upon one WC, youth of 19 years, in the peace of God, and then and there did make an assault on him, and did beat, wound, and ill-treat with an intent that most horrid and detestable crime among Christians not to be named, called sodomy. So one of the reasons why I include this particular story is this is one of the earliest cases in the young republic of someone being charged and convicted with sodomy. Now, this case that you see here, as far as I have been able to find, we only know about it from basically about 3 pages in a book talking about court cases heard before the Maryland Court of Appeals. So initially Davis was convicted in Baltimore County. He appealed on the grounds saying that he could not get a fair trial in Baltimore County and asked for the case to be reheard. And by a 4-1 decision, the Maryland Court of Appeals refused to allow that to happen. A judge sentenced him to be imprisoned for 3 months from January 9th to April 9th of 1811, and to stand in the pillory for 15 minutes. He was also required to pay the state a fine of $500, and his jail sentence was to be increased until the fine had been paid. Again, essentially all we know about this, all that I have been able to find so far about this case is just from this one account in the Court of Appeals. I had grand ambitions of trying to find either William S. Davis or William Carpenter in the census records. Now, in 1810, there are 12 William Davises in the state census, 7 of which are in Worcester County on the Eastern Shore. And in the Baltimore City Directory, this one's from 1803, there's 2 William Davises, and in the 1814 directory, there's 2 as well. So the problem with the fact that this is such a common, non-unique name means that it's going to be difficult to find anything more about them, especially when the census tends to list heads of households rather than people individually. That doesn't happen until closer to mid-century. So, wish me luck. What's interesting, though, and sort of where I'll end this case, is that for the sodomy laws in the 1600s and in the 1700s, the punishment for sodomy essentially was death. And we know of at least 10 men executed for sodomy in the colonial period from the 1600s until 1776. When William Davis makes his appeal in 1810, the law had changed in Maryland just the prior year in 1809, where punishment for sodomy was 1 to 10 years. A lot of states did not have their sodomy laws overturned until, I believe, the 60s. For some it was the 60s, and for others I think the laws were still on the books even until, they weren't prosecuted, but the laws were still on the books, I think even until the 90s. The laws in some cases vary a little bit by state. In Maryland, I think sodomy was understood to be strictly just between men. In Virginia, by contrast, around the same time, the very early 1800s, women could be prosecuted as perpetrators of sodomy, but not as victims. Make of that what you will. Speaking of women, around the time of the Civil War, there's an interesting book by Farah Jasmine Griffin that is a collection of letters exchanged between two African American women, Rebecca Primus and Addie Brown. Now, their lives begin in Hartford, Connecticut, but in the fall of 1865, just after the Civil War, Rebecca Primus travels to Royal Oak, Maryland, to open a school for children who had been born enslaved. Royal Oak is about halfway between Easton and St. Michael's, so most of this book is a collection of letters from Rebecca writing from the eastern shore of Maryland to Addie, who is still up in Connecticut. Rebecca worked for this school for 4 years, and the community even named the school the Primus Institute after her. And what's interesting is that Rebecca writes a lot about her time in Maryland and the struggles that she had within the community and her work as a school teacher. One of the letters that she writes, she says, and I quote, "These white people want all the respect shown them by the colored people. I give what I receive and no more," end quote. Now, what's important about this collection of letters is that even from a letter as early as 1859, it's clear that their relationship had sexual overtones. One of the letters that Addie Brown writes, she says, "You are the first girl that I ever loved so, and you are the last one. Dear Rebecca, do not say anything against me, loving you so, for I mean just what I say. Oh, Rebecca, it seems I can see you now, casting those loving eyes at me. If you was a man, what would things come to? They would after come to something very quick. What do you think of the matter? Don't laugh at me. I'm not exactly crazy yet." Addie and Rebecca's correspondence is important for a lot of reasons, and especially since considering the amount of sort of intimate personal material that you have about the lives of African American women in the mid-19th century, there really is just not a lot of material to work with to begin with.
They were African American?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons why Rebecca founds the school for former children who had been formerly enslaved. Actually, you can, in Annapolis, the school does not survive as far as I can tell, but this is the case in the walking tour of Annapolis where I take advantage of that, because at 91 East Street, there's a building, the Church of the Galilean Fishermen, which in the 1860s was set up as a private school for children who had been formerly enslaved. So this is a case where the landscape of Annapolis actually allows us to tell the story with the building right in front of us that served this purpose. Now, one of the other things I find interesting about the correspondence between Rebecca Primus and Addie Brown is the fact that even though they were both African American women, they still came from very different backgrounds. Rebecca Primus's family was very well respected in the free black community of Hartford, and they had been there for several generations. Her father was a grocery store clerk and her mother was a dressmaker, and they owned their own home. The 1850 census shows that the household claimed $1,200 worth of real estate, which was well above the average for free blacks in the North. And throughout Rebecca's family, her family plays a very strong role in her life as a support system. Rebecca also was able to gain a high school education and become a school teacher. And there's a photograph of Rebecca. Well, there's a photograph of the church Rebecca attended from 1922, and the person that you see circled there has been identified as Rebecca Primus. I have not been able to verify any of this independently myself, so make of that what you will. But I thought it was worth including all the same. If you contrast Rebecca's life with that of Addie Brown, Addie was an orphan and 5 years younger than Rebecca. She had no family support to speak of, and her letters essentially express a jealous of Rebecca's close relationship with her family. She lacked a formal education and spent most of her life working as a domestic servant. And the letters between the two women really reveal the fact that Addie was very sensitive about this class difference between the two. She often questioned her right to love or even be loved by Rebecca. And one of the things that Addie keeps referring to is a novel published in 1850 by the name of Wilhelms Friendships, which tells the story of an aristocratic woman named Lady Ida and her relationship with a middle-class woman named Florence Leslie. And Addie keeps referring to this novel in the lectures, and where she basically explores her anxiety about the fact that Rebecca is someone that she loves but she feels unequal to. One other interesting incident between the two women that's recorded in these letters, it concerns an exchange in the Primus household shortly after Rebecca went to Maryland. Addie visited the Primus family and was told that they had recently received a letter from Rebecca, at which point a neighbor inquired if it was a gentleman's letter, insinuating that the neighbor believed that the letter was addressed to Addie and that it was an explicitly romantic letter, the kind that a gentleman would write to a lady, essentially. Addie recorded in her letter that Rebecca's sister came to her defense. And she says, "She said, I thought of you if you was a gentleman. She also said if either one of us was a gent, we would marry. I was quite surprised at the remark. Mr. James and I had quite a little argument. He says, when I find someone to love, I will throw you over the shoulder. I told him, never." What we do know eventually, though, is that both Rebecca and Addie ended up being married to men. Addie writes to Rebecca of a few of the suitors that she had, both men and women, all the while claiming that she loved Rebecca the less and reassuring them that she didn't love them the way that she loved Rebecca. What I think is interesting is that Rebecca's family acknowledged the attachment of the two women, but it was also not seen as something that was incompatible with the heterosexual partnership. Another of Rebecca's family, Rebecca's Aunt Emily, went so far as to counsel Addie that she should not let her relationship with Rebecca get in the way of her relationship with her fiancé, as recorded in another letter. What Addie says is, "How I have missed you. I have lost all. No more pleasure for me now. Aunt Emily asked me last eve if I was going to carry that sober face until you return. She also said if Mr. Tynes was to see me, think that I care more for you than I did for him. I told him I did love you more than I ever would with him. She said I better not tell him so. It would be the truth and most else." it seems that Rebecca was opposed to the idea of Addie marrying Joseph Tynes, but in the end, she did, and she seems to have approached it from a practical matter. It made a lot more sense for her financially to navigate the world as a married woman rather than as a single black woman. And although female-headed households were not unique, she saw that as a remote possibility with Rebecca. After postponing the wedding several times, Addie marries Joseph Tynes in 1866, and at this point, her correspondence with Rebecca ends, and she dies 2 years later in 1868. Rebecca taught in Maryland until 1869, at which point she returns to Connecticut, and she marries a man named Charles Thomas, her former landlord in Maryland and a former slave, and she lives until 1932, where she dies at the age of 95. How am I doing with time? Perfect. So I have two more main stories to tell. You can't talk about the story of Annapolis without talking about the U.S. Naval Academy. And in 2002, there was a doctoral dissertation published, or it was written but never released to the public. It was published by a gentleman who now works at the National Archives by the name of Michael Hussey, and it was. I have the title somewhere else, but essentially the title is it's something to the effect of, do you know what it is when a man lies with a man as he would with a woman? And it's a study of naval courts-martial from 1890 until 1925. And it examines basically men in the U.S. Navy during this time period who were tried on charges of sodomy, and looking at the different court cases that were involved. Now, the cartoon that you see here, I want you to pay attention to this gentleman here on the left. This is a series of cartoons from 1918 called Life in the Navy. And it's a series of humorous cartoons that a naval officer did, sort of like daily life scenes. So, things like, what a mess the mess hall is, and cartoons like that. But, and the sort of, with this scene, it says keep off fresh paint, and there's all of these soldiers, sleeping, reading, playing tricks on each other on this naval chest that's just been painted. And so there's the humor behind that. But the gentleman on the left is of particular interest because the caption reads, "I am some chicken. I hear a gentle voice a-calling. I wonder why you don't put this chest in a glass case." And he's referring to this guy who's saying, get off that dang chest, essentially. But there's a couple things about this guy. The fact that he refers to himself as a chicken, and that if you look at his kerchief, all the other guys sort of wear it around his neck. He's decided to tie it in the front, essentially as a bow. And so the fact that he refers to himself as a chicken, that's a slang term for a younger man who likes a partner who's an older, active man, let's say. So what I find interesting about this is that on the one hand, he's clearly mocking men in the Navy, who were openly gay. At the same time, I think it's utterly fascinating that he's included in there at all. I think that this is something that is really, in 1918 and even in the 1920s, for me, it shows a different attitude towards, let's say, womanly men than you would see in the 1940s or in the 1950s, where there was a lot more persecution. I mean, the guy pictured on the left here, he's still obviously an object of derision, but again, the fact that he is included, I think, is something that is still really important. Hussey is the one who brought my attention to this cartoon in the first place, but he also, one of the key pieces in his dissertation, which, if you would like to read it, it's in the Hornbeck Library at the University of Maryland, and you can read it there. But there's a court-martial from 1916 that's related to the USS Constellation, which is the ship that's in the Baltimore Harbor. An officer named William Malloy, who had served in the Navy for 26 years, was accused of asking two younger, lower-ranking officers to, quote, shag him, end quote. Two other sailors named Charles Foster and Lionel Provost were named as having sodomized William Malloy, while all three were on shore in Newport, Rhode Island. I'll stay here for a moment. The two young soldiers, Foster and Provost, were found guilty, and they served 2 years at the Naval Prison in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. But the story of William Malloy is very interesting to unpack. Apparently his behavior, particularly for younger men who were lower ranked than he, Malloy was probably mid-40s, and Provost and Foster were 18 and 19 respectively. This behavior was present on two other ships before his service on the Constellation. His activities were well known. They called several witnesses who attested to this fact, but they weren't prosecuted then. One witness testified that Malloy was nicknamed Jenny, and that there were other sailors on board one of the previous ships who went by Stella, Daisy, real name Lee, and another who went by Helen. Here I have it. Malloy was 47 years old, and since he was a higher-ranking officer who took the passive role on ships who went by Stella, Daisy, real name Lee, and another who went by Helen. Here I have it. Malloy was 47 years old, and since he was a higher-ranking officer who took the passive role with the two younger, lower-ranking officers, this was very, very scandalous, and his prison sentence in all of the courts-martial that Hussey studied, it was the harshest out of all of them. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, of which he served 4 years and 8 months. And for point of reference, one of the things that I found interesting was the fact that the different places involved. Now there is a story, there is a book about same-sex relationships in the U.S. military from the 1960s onwards, which do refer to there's a lesbian couple who met at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, I believe either in the 60s or in the 70s, and you can read about that then. I have a sheet with an annotated bibliography of some of the sources that I consulted for this lecture, which if you want, I can show you that at the end. But I wanted to talk about my last talk of the day. It's not the gentleman who you see pictured here. About 8 days ago, there was an article published about this gentleman, William Dorsey Swan, which you may or may not have seen. And William Dorsey Swan was born in Maryland in 1858, and when he was born, he was still enslaved. But during his adult life, he lives mostly in Washington, D.C., and he hosts a lot of drag balls. Essentially,
he gets called the Queen. That's the name he chose to go by when he was dressed up. And the drag balls that he hosted were raided several times by the police in the 1880s. If you want to read more about him, I definitely recommend it. It's someone else's research, so I won't deliberate upon it. But I wanted to include the story in here for those who weren't familiar with it. My last story is, which has not been discussed quite so recently or openly. There is shortly after World War I, there is a fellow from Baltimore by the name of George Pedutzi who makes his debut as a drag superstar going by the name of Carol Norman. So you see basically him in men's clothes, but holding his outfit right here. And Pedutzi went by the moniker the Creole Fashion Plate, which Groucho Marx poked fun of by calling him the queer old fashion plate. There's an article from the Baltimore News American from 1920 basically saying, George Pedutzi, it's a different spelling, alias Carol Norman, alias the Creole Fashion Plate, and a Baltimore boy to boot, presented his extremely clever act last week at the Maryland. I don't believe the Maryland Theater exists anymore. And I wanted to talk about Carol Norman for several reasons today. This act was huge in the 1920s, and it was part of a phenomenon called the Pansy craze, where there were several, we talk a lot about how RuPaul's Drag Race is very, very big, but in the 1920s, drag was mainstream in a lot of different ways. And Carol Norman was one of about 3 drag superstars. And he grew up in an Italian family. I think in 1910 they were living on East Lombard Street. I can't remember it exactly, but they were from the eastern part of Baltimore. And the primary means of, and the primary artifacts of Carol Norman that survive, Carol Norman appears on sheet music advertising it. And there are probably about at least 30 pieces of sheet music with their picture on the front cover. This is an advertisement for a show that Carol Norman was headlining, but I'm Through Shedding Tears Over You, song, lyric by Carol Norman, music by Edwin Weber, and the Remick Company publishes a lot of sheet music with Carol Norman's picture. Carol Norman had nothing to do with this song, but except for the fact that you'll see the photo there, and usually as introduced by Carol Norman, as sung by Carol Norman. And we know that Carol Norman was also a lyricist. I desperately wanted to have a song sung by Carol Norman to play for you all today. I spent weeks searching. I found something. There is a song that Carol Norman wrote lyrics for called Nobody Cried When They Said That I Cried Over You. It's about a minute long. You can go now. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Refuses to die.
There we go.
I'll advance on to the next slide. Before I take questions, I wanted to ask you, the music that you heard, what did it sound like?
Calliope.
Circus music?
Calliope.
Calliope? What? Early burlesque? I found several cover versions of Nobody Lied, and I chose that one because that was from originally it was from a CD of merry-go-round music. So this is something that I think is I found really, really fascinating about the song, is that not only was this a huge song back in the 1920s, but the fact that, you know, I've never understood the protect the children arguments, because we had a drag queen who wrote a song that appeared on carousels back in the 1920s. So I'll end there for now. My voice is getting a little bit hoarse, and open the floor up to questions.